The deafening roar of the F-4 Phantom II tore through the skies of Vietnam as the combat mission unfolded to a symphony of explosions and gunfire. It was August 18, 1965, the first time this icon of American aviation made its combat debut, and anticipation hung in the air like a thick morning fog. The pilots, nervous but determined, prepped at Bien Hoa Air Base, keenly aware that the hopes of American air superiority rested on their wings. But the grandeur and promising technology of the F-4 would soon meet a harsh reality. As the imposing machine gained altitude, the first combat reports crackled over the radios. Phantom is wheels up and can be seen approaching the combat zone. The static-laced voices vibrated with energetic and anxiety, but also with hopeful expectation. On the ground, North Vietnamese soldiers watched with disgusted contempt. "Those birds can't touch us," they said, laughing at the novelty, unaware of what was coming. To them, the F-4 Phantom was just another symbol of American arrogance, an easy target for a well-trained guerrilla force. Confident expression spread across the North Vietnamese camp as they prepared to face what they believed was another futile gesture. But as the F-4's engines roared, the promises of superiority were quickly put to the test. During the initial combat approach, the aircraft's onboard systems experienced surprising failures. The pilots' eyes were glued to their instrument panels as they tried to adjust to the harsh terrain below. The F-4, though technologically advanced, would face challenges that not even the best military planners had foreseen. The first moments of combat were marked by difficulties, revealing a jarring contrast between high expectations and the tactical reality on the ground. When enemy aircraft were spotted, the tension spiked. The F-4 not only had to engage in aerial combat, but also endure a hailstorm of ground fire. Energetic pulsed through the pilots' veins as they were pushed beyond their limits. "We need to show the world we're here to win," one of the officers muttered over the radio. The atmosphere was charged with hope, but the enemy's mocking scorn still echoed in the pilots' minds. In response, the North Vietnamese soldiers silenced their enemy's celebration with bursts from their machine guns. "Machines won't beat us," they laughed, oblivious to the devastating potential of the advanced weapons closing in. The F-4 was designed to be all-powerful, but the partisans, as they were known, were determined to show a near-omnipotent air system that relentless resistance could change the course of battle. The first shots began to ring out, and the pilots scrambled to adjust to the North Vietnamese guerrilla tactics, armed with old but powerful machine guns under the cover of ambush techniques. The sounds of the F-4's engines mixed with the din of combat, creating a desperate scene where confidence faded and reality took hold. The earlier jeers became a constant reminder that the fight was just beginning. The pilots felt a mix of determination and nervous confusion, a sense of anger and desperate helplessness as they dealt with an enemy that not only refused to yield to technological promises, but also exploited the vulnerability of the unknown. And so, the first operation of the F-4 Phantom II became a battle not just between machines, but between expectations and the serious brutality of real war. The weapon that promised redemption for the American war machine had not yet revealed its true capability. What the North Vietnamese didn't know was that aggressive payback was coming, and the U.S. Air Force was about to enter a chess match where the F-4 Phantom II's power was already being re-evaluated. How many more challenges would they have to face before, finally, in the clouds, technology overcame the enemy's initial defiance? The F-4 Phantom II, with its promise to revolutionize air warfare, was a direct response to the serious demands of the Vietnam War. In an era marked by serious political military turmoil, the United States invested heavily in technology that could not only match but surpass the strategic calculations of an enemy that dominated the terrain. From its conception at the McDonnell Aircraft Corporation in 1958, the F-4 was designed as a multi-role fighter, capable of executing a variety of missions, including enemy interception, bombing, and reconnaissance. With a top speed of 1,473 miles per hour, its confidence, responsiveness was a decisive factor in such a vast and hostile theater of operations. Equipped with two J-79 engines, the F-4 could reach altitudes of up to 50,000 feet, lifting it far from ground threats while making it a difficult target for enemy fire. With its robust configuration, the Phantom II could carry over 18,000 pounds of ordnance, an amount equivalent to the total weight of a light combat vehicle and significantly more than much of the North Vietnamese arsenal. However, while these specifications were impressive, in practice, the F-4 also faced a series of challenges that exposed its vulnerabilities. During combat missions, the reliance on sophisticated electronic systems was not always dependable. Pilots frequently reported radar and communication failures, which were serious, extremely critical on a battlefield like Vietnam. The spirit of innovation was there, but its practical application, in the hands of soldiers under pressure, was a more complicated concept. In the heart of the Vietnam War, technology became both a protagonist and a double-edged sword. For its adversaries, the arrival of the F-4 presented an opportunity for change, but also a mix of naive contempt and skepticism. The idea that the old guard of guerrilla warfare could be defeated by a handful of war machines was disgusted to swallow. "Those metal birds don't know what it's like to fly in the darkness of the jungle," a provincial commander said, expressing his confidence in well-trained guerrillas who knew every inch of the terrain. The F-4's role was clear: to transform the battlefield by taking the war to the skies, away from the ground combat where North Vietnamese forces proved so skilled. Every planned operation aimed to study the aircraft's effectiveness in the field and, at the same time, prove to the enemy the sarcastic futility of their guerrilla tactics. But the initial failures during its debut raised serious questions about the F-4's ability to dismantle such a fierce resistance structure. Battlefield observers began to nervous. Was this new machine really up to the challenge? Enemy aviators began to study its patterns and discovered gaps where they could attack: ambushes, ground support structures, and, above all, the impressive adaptability of the guerrillas. This led to an important question that hung in the minds of Air Force commanders. How can we keep our enemy, who is already laughing at our presence, from preparing for the F-4's true power? This dilemma created an urgent need for adaptation, both at the strategic level and in field implementation. Tactics, initially premature, were modified to meet the demands presented by the enemy. Meanwhile, engineers worked on improvements and upgrades to ensure that every F-4 leaving the hangar passed the required endurance tests. What was about to happen would be a new chapter in the narrative of the war, where overcoming weaknesses would become as serious as leveraging strengths. With every failure, every hesitation, the F-4 Phantom II approached a confluence point where technology and combat would intertwine explosively. The F-4 was still transforming into a legitimate force to be reckoned with, and anticipation grew amid a palpable tension between the opposing forces. Thus, the battle for the F-4's recognition and its rise to the status of a combat symbol marked the beginning of a journey that would change the course of the war. How the final blow would be delivered remained a question, as did how much longer the North Vietnamese could, mock before the true strength of the F-4 was revealed. How could a sarcastic enemy prepare for the F-4's real power? The F-4 Phantom II's first major combat operation was approaching, and with it, the clash between technological innovation and the harsh reality of combat became more evident. On December 15, 1965, American pilots prepared for a mission that promised to test all the capabilities of the new war machine. The objective: to conduct an airstrike on a North Vietnamese supply depot, which, according to reconnaissance reports, served as a major logistics hub for guerrilla forces. However, what seemed like a surprised operation would soon turn into a fearful, harrowing test. The aircraft took off from the Da Nang base, their engines roaring like thunder, spreading a cloud of hope among the troops on the ground. The pilots were energetic, but the tension was palpable. "Let's show 'em what we're made of," a lieutenant said, adjusting his visor. For many, this was a chance to answer the angry taunts of the North Vietnamese soldiers who were so willing to dismiss the F-4's power. On the other side, however, the guerrillas' confidence was growing. They believed they could adapt to any new threat, a spirit that fueled their ambush and resistance tactics. The F-4 attack formation advanced toward the target, but predictability was a fatal weakness. The North Vietnamese soldiers, well trained in guerrilla warfare, waited patiently. They hid in the shadows of the dense jungle, ready to unleash what they knew best: surprise. As they neared the supply depot, the pilots noticed something strange. The silence, which in previous operations had been broken by gunfire, was now shattered by shouted alerts transmitted by radio. "Weapons free! Target is just a few clicks out!" one of the officers yelled. Then, chaos. The F-4s released their bombs, but in a short moment, a devastating roar echoed through the forest. The explosion that should have marked victory quickly turned into confusion as enemy defenses, far more robust than commanders had anticipated, came online. Gunfire and explosions reverberated in a crimson clamor, revealing not only the enemy's presence, but a well-laid plan that the North Vietnamese soldiers had put into practice. In the blink of an eye, the mission turned into a clash between American innovation and guerrilla cunning. Scenes of battle shattered the polished ideal of air combat. The F-4s, for all their power, were sad, vulnerable in their predictable nature. The ability to carry air-to-air missiles and smart bombs didn't matter when the enemy knew every flaw, every weakness. Pilots scrambled to adapt to the new reality, trying to evade fire from ground weapons that, however antiquated, proved equally effective. The men in the aircraft began to feel a mixture of frustration and fearful. "We need to realign our tactics," one of the pilots exclaimed in a transmission as his fuel gauge dipped. The sarcastic laughter of the North Vietnamese garrison echoed in their heads, filled with the certainty that even the most advanced technology was susceptible to ingenuity and survival. "They're getting desperate! Don't let them laugh at us!" the officers yelled in desperation. When the first F-4 spotted targets of opportunity and engaged in a retaliatory move, the situation turned into a nervous, deadly dance of uncertainty and adaptation. The chasm between expectation and reality became clear in the struggle between the pilots trying to dominate the air and the fighters using every element of the terrain to their advantage. The F-4 was becoming more than a machine. It was a symbol of melancholic hopes. In the heat of combat, the response came and turned mockery into serious respect. However, the question was whether the F-4 Phantom II could survive the test of its first decisive missions. Guns fired and explosions lit up every corner of the jungle, as if each burst of fire sought to dismantle previously held certainties. Shattering the remnants of invulnerability, the F-4 made it clear that the war would be a landscape of continuous adaptation, where past and future would fight with a deafening roar. In the heart of the battlefield, it remained to be seen. Could the shame of its setbacks be transformed into hopeful? At dawn on July 14, 1966, the mud-filled rivers and thick jungles of Vietnam witnessed a new serious operation, Operation Hastings. As the F-4 Phantom II flew over the battlefield, a palpable urgency filled the air. The mission was clear: to support ground troops in the Quang Tri region, a strategic point near the 17th parallel. The objective was to dismantle a fortified North Vietnamese army position, a task that not only sought to exorcise the scars of the past, but also to prove the effectiveness of air power on the battlefield. Faint sounds of battle echoed in the distance as the F-4 pilots prepared for the first bombing run. The tension formed an oppressive layer, like a storm about to break. "We're almost there," one of the pilots whispered, exchanging nervous glances with his comrades. The specter of defeat still loomed, and they knew they could either validate or dispel the uncertainties that had arisen in previous combat reports. After the sad experience of the last mission, many were merely masking their insecurity, remembering the enemy's sarcastic mockery and disregard. The F-4s, armed with high-precision bombs and missiles, were in position. The descent toward the target was accompanied by a cacophony of electronic sounds and radio calls. With each second, the ground rushed up to meet them as the war-torn landscape reflected in their visors. Panic was present, but in the voices of the operators on the ground, the hopeful certainty that they would finally get support was becoming more and more real. As the bombs began to fall, a mysterious silence took over, replacing the roar of the engines. The earth exploded into fragments. Clouds of smoke and dust formed like fearful monsters. The thunder of the explosions resonated through the forests, and the men on the ground felt empowered. "Now that's air power!" a sergeant shouted as debris flew through the air. But the joy was short-lived. Amid the chaos, the North Vietnamese fighters showed their determination. "They're hitting us, but they're not winning yet," a guerrilla commander declared, adjusting his aim. The battle intensified as the F-4, increasingly in demand, faced new realities. The first direct response to the airstrike was a storm of anti-aircraft fire that erupted in the form of machine gun rounds and rockets, putting the pilots on constant alert. Guerrilla tactics, once again, demonstrated that adaptation was the essence of the fight. The F-4 climbed, dove, and performed daring maneuvers, all to avoid becoming an easy target. But the pressure was intense. "I'm losing altitude," a pilot yelled. "Hang on, we're in the fight," another replied, their voices echoing over the radio. The determination was evident, but sadly, reality proved cruel. Every turn and every dive was not just a maneuver, but a fearful dance between life and death. On the edge between reality and desire, the F-4 was more than a symbol. It was the line between triumph and tragedy, between cutting-edge technology and tactical cunning. The missions in Operation Hastings provided a dramatic revelation. The roar of explosions and the echo of crossfire illustrated the serious, ongoing challenge the F-4 faced. The ruins of enemy positions gave the false sense of victory being within reach. But when the first signs of setbacks became visible among the troops, the resistance grew ever more fierce. Confidence, once high, threatened to crumble. By the end of the day, after a frantic cycle of attack and response, the American forces had to withdraw. The price paid had been high, but the true test was not limited to tactical results. The F-4 Phantoms would remain a symbol of the struggle, but questions lingered. Could technological superiority truly turn the tide of battle? Or was it just an illusion built on a romanticized view of war? Could American aviation hopefully recover and learn from the lessons of Operation Hastings before it become a forgotten footnote in history? That question hung like an enigmatic cloud over the battlefield, accentuating the gravity of the decisions to come. August 1966 marked the emotional and physical attrition of the air campaign in the Vietnam War. The skirmish in Quang Tri was escalating into a large-scale conflict involving not only aviation, but the infamous Battle of Khe Sanh. The region had become a flashpoint of resistance, where North Vietnamese guerrillas erected their defenses, confident by their previous show of resilience. The tension in the air was palpable as the F-4 Phantoms took off at dawn on January 21st. The pilots felt a thrilling mix of anxiety and determination. "Today, we show them what we're really capable of," a captain said, his gaze fixed on the runway. The mission was a concentrated bombing run on the fortified position of Khe Sanh, where enemy lines had been detected. The orders were clear: strategic bombing to force the enemy to retreat. It was the moment to demonstrate the true effectiveness of the F-4, a true test of mettle and morale. As they approached the target, a symphony of alarms and noises echoed in the cockpits. The first visual contact with the enemy positions made hearts race. The ground below was teeming with intense activity, indicating the enemy's preparation. "Visual on the target! Prepare to engage!" an officer shouted. The orders reverberated, and energetic intensified. Adrenaline surged as the pilots danced between death and survival. Delivering the first blows, the F-4s unleashed a shower of explosives on the fortifications. The scene unfolded cinematically. Explosions lit up the jungle, producing a palette of vivid colors against the tangled green. However, only a sad moment of triumph was granted. The echo of the explosions drew enemy fire, and anti-aircraft cannons began to open up. An F-4 was hit, and surprised cries of shock cut through the radio. "Bird hit! I repeat, bird hit!" was the call from one of the pilots who witnessed the scene. "Watch your six! They're waiting for us!" another warned, aware of what could happen. The scene was rapidly turning into a nightmare. North Vietnamese guerrilla tactics had evolved since Operation Hastings, increasing their effectiveness. The Marines and defenders were skilled, and the F-4s, as powerful as they were, once again felt sad, vulnerable to a ground riddled with traps and crossfire.
With each mission, it became clear that what was initially seen as a technological advantage was starting to become a burden. The F-4s were remarkable machines, weaponry, deployment capability, maneuverability. But the reality of guerrilla tactics was beginning to cast a melancholic shadow over the aircraft's metallic sheen. Soldiers were held hostage by the tactics designed by a cunning enemy, a challenge that intensified as the fighting progressed. The day wore on, and the climax of the confrontation was marked by a series of coordinated attacks. The battle was at a peak that challenged both human and mechanical capabilities. "We're making progress! Push harder!" a commander shouted, trying to maintain the pilots' morale. The determination was palpable in their voices, but the feeling that victory might not be within reach, melancholic, persisted. As the sun set,
smoke began to swirl, mixing with the agonizing atmosphere of the battle. The cost of the operations had become clear. The F-4s were succumbing to an enemy that not only knew how to fight, but also how to survive. The American forces, buckling under the weight of unmet expectations, withdrew with significant losses. The recognition that technology alone was not the solution became inescapable. In the pilot's eyes, victory was distorting into a cruel shadow. "How did we lose? We have all the technology," one of them thought, as reality began to crumble under the pressure of constant engagement. A lack of reconnaissance and adaptation merged into a cycle that threatened to become a troubling and persistent pattern. At the end of that fateful day, as the echoes of battle dissipated, the nervous doubt lingered. Were the F-4 Phantoms symbols of a lauded promise, robust enough to withstand the relentless fire of a resilient enemy? The winds were changing, and the fight for adaptation and transformation had only just begun. As the smoke from the Battle of Khe Sanh cleared, a new understanding began to form over the arid terrain and the lessons of war. On the other side of the front lines, North Vietnamese commanders watched attentively, aware that the F-4 Phantom II represented both a challenge and an opportunity. They quickly recognized that American technology, however impressive, was no guarantee of victory. The need to adapt became obvious. General Vo Nguyen Giap, a renowned and cunning strategist, envisioned new tactics he could use to neutralize the United States' air superiority. "How can we absorb the impact of their air power?" a North Vietnamese commander pondered as he drew plans on worn maps. He realized the secret lay in using cunning and knowledge of the terrain to their advantage. Instead of waiting for a direct approach from the F-4s, they decided to set traps and reinforce their positions, utilizing their proven guerrilla skills. Explosive traps and underground bunkers were improved, all while the fighters grew more confident in their ability to evade airstrikes. In the nights that followed the battles, in the ongoing information war, dozens of intelligence documents were analyzed, and every U.S. troop movement was meticulously watched. A young Viet Cong veteran, Nguyen Huong, reflected on the events of the past few weeks. With a confident smile, he stated, "Technology can attack us from the sky, but we are masters of our home. We face fear one day at a time, and we will need to exploit this weakness." The fighting continued to intensify, and as new bombing missions were launched over North Vietnamese positions, it became clear that the resistance was not just resolute, it was methodical. "They learn fast," an American pilot commented in a moment of frustration. "They changed their tactics after Khe Sanh. We need to do the same." The cycle of adaptation continued, but the speed of the war made every response serious. North Vietnamese forces began to implement a new strategy: concealment.
In terrains previously identified as easy targets, troops now moved under the cover of dense vegetation, using the environment's features to their advantage instead of brute force. The strategy was to divert the attention of American aviation, while troops under Jop's command waged a psychological game, creating the impression that their offensive was not just underway, but gaining momentum. The resulting shocks began to create a strategic dilemma for the United States. With the Air Force's offensive stuck in a cycle of inaction and despair due to enemy adaptations, commanders began to let go of their sad, blind faith in technological superiority. A Pentagon general who had always believed in machines now saw a war that was not just about weaponry, but also about minds and hearts. We need to understand that this war isn't just about guns, a senior officer declared. Versatility and cunning in guerrilla maneuvers can overcome any hardware we have. We need to revise our approach. Meanwhile, in the field, F-4 pilots were preparing for a new mission. "Today, we test our endurance even more," they said to each other, offering hopeful encouragement under pressure. But as the aircraft flew over the positions, there was a fearful new kind of fear in the air. Not just the threat of weapons, but the strategy behind them. Recognizing their vulnerabilities had become a serious matter of life or death. As the engines roared and the payload began to fall, one of the pilots spotted a series of explosions. With it came a glimpse of the chaos that the enemy's adaptation patrolled. "It's a trap!" he yelled. In an instant, a nervous shadow of a doubt loomed. How could they overcome an adversary who had once again become a treacherous shadow, a force that could turn the tide? Those who had sarcastic laughed before now faced a reality of fearful terror and cunning on the battlefield. As the dust settled, it became evident that the F-4s were facing a transformation not only in combat tactics, but also in the perception that war was not just about fighting an enemy with weapons. It was a struggle for the soul of the resistance, where overcoming technology did not mean dominance, but a constant, incisive, and radical search for adaptation and transformation. And so, the battle continued, where questions lingered in the shadows, and the answers would only reveal themselves through constant hardening on the front lines. The landscape of the Vietnam War was more complex than anyone could have imagined. The F-4 Phantom II, once the emblem of American air superiority, now symbolized a symbol of a continuous struggle in a war of perceptions, ambitions, and strategies. As the conflict unfolded in its brutality, the echoes of battle told a story of adaptation and resilience on both the American and North Vietnamese sides. With the bombing campaign intensifying in scale and complexity, American forces finally accepted that militarization alone would not guarantee success. Redefining their approach became a serious priority. "This war is not just a succession of battles in the sky," a lieutenant colonel reflected, adopting a calm perspective. "Hopeful, it's a fight for the support of the people, for their hearts and minds." This new philosophy began to seep into military command doctrines, offering a more holistic view of what was at stake. On the front lines, the fighters watched. The indomitable spirit of the North Vietnamese warriors, led by a general who seemed at ease with both strategy and brutality, challenged every aerial advance. Guerrilla tactics were being further refined. American intelligence faced a serious, monumental challenge. A North Vietnamese soldier told his comrades, "They have technology, but we have the land. And as long as we are skilled, they will never own this place.
The local environment was their ally, a terrain that offered both protection and opportunities for ambushes. With the climate of the war changing, the very purpose of the F-4 was realized through its more intelligent and integrated use. Other branches of the armed forces began to call for inter-service cooperation on the battlefield. No longer playing a merely devastating role, the aircraft's attack tactics became diversified. The focus shifted to supporting rather than simply bombing without thought. The maneuver of close coordination with ground troops was received as a hopeful new hope. Moments of calm reflection followed each battle. In a corner of the airbase, a group of pilots gathered, discussing the challenges they faced. "This is a fight for our mentality as much as for our technological capability," one of them asserted. Indeed, the ongoing struggle to win the hearts and minds of the Vietnamese involved not only military strategies but also civil actions. The need to build trust with the locals, rather than just bombing their lands, began to become clear. The narrative of resistance was not confined to combat, but also extended to the political and social spheres. As voices against the war emerged within the United States, the perception of the global audience was changing. It was clear that this war, frozen in time, was a battle for values. The moral and ethical questions became seriously evident. The seed sown in the field of public opinion shaped the reality of the war, instigating a debate about the sad, true human cost behind the war machines. In the months that followed, bombing operations were redefined. Tactical efficiency gained a greater focus on smaller operations, targeting specific actions rather than heavy-handed approaches. With close air support, each F-4 became a conduit for a dialogue about the very nature of battle. The dialogue, full of connection between forces on the ground and in the air, began to pave the way for this new dynamic and create a sense of hopeful, shared purpose. Over time, the image of the F-4 evolved. It was no longer the symbol of a merciless war, but rather a vehicle of hopeful, transformative strategy. Connection is our greatest strength. We need the land, the people, more than any bomb, a veteran pilot emphasized. The flames of national pride burned, and at the same time, generated a constant awareness of the impact of their actions throughout the war. Finally, as the conflict reached an intense climax, the accumulated lessons, both in high command and in the trenches, began to reflect a new understanding that could very well transform future combat. The F-4 Phantom II, though still loaded with weaponry, now became the emblem of tenacity, a representation not just of a war of combat machines, but also of a struggle for human presence. And so, the fight in Vietnam endured, its legacy intertwining war, politics, and cultural transformation. The battles still raged, but those questions resonated in the minds and hearts of the combatants, and the lessons learned would become eternal in the long history of the search for peace and justice. On this journey, the question remained, what would be the true cost of overcoming technology in the name of adaptability? The winds of change would still blow over the battlefields, carrying the voices of war beyond the action, echoing for generations to come.